Are we building enough houses? Should we pay reparations for slavery? And how much money should the government borrow? This is Politics Live. On today's programme, Conservative MP and former Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng, Labour MP Clive Lewis, former Labour advisor and presenter of the Power Test podcast Ayesha Hazarika, and Patrick Maguire of The Times. Today.
It is ridiculous that the care home sector is handing out visas like sweeties.
Isn't it about time, Minister, that we had a cap on migration?
Anger on the Tory backbenches over record net migration levels.
My family in England owned slaves here on Grenada, and though we never set foot on the island, we profited from the sale of sugar.
This ancestor of slave owners is campaigning for slavery reparations. With this, Labour MP of Grenadan heritage will talk to both of them. Labour's shifting position on borrowing £28 billion for green investment. Could the pledge be watered down further?
An additional £28 billion of capital investment in our country's green transition for each and every year of this decade. We will get to the £28 billion. It will be in the second half of the first Parliament.
We'll talk to a former Chancellor who knows a thing or two about borrowing after his mini-budget last year. All that, and we'll bring you Prime Minister's questions live at noon.
I'm not going to cut.
Those observant amongst you, including my guest, you'll have noticed they were out of sequence towards the end, but welcome anyway. Let's talk about house building targets and just show you this story, BBC News. Government misses annual house building target again. Now, Parliament was pledged to meet 300,000 new homes a year by the end of this Parliament. Well, it's hit 240,000 in the year 2022 to 2023. Is it good enough, Kwasi?
No, clearly not. I mean, it's not a good idea if you set a target and miss it. You can't claim a success. But I think it is a politically difficult situation because you've got lots of MPs on both sides, actually, who are very reluctant to see more house building.
Right, but should the targets have been kept? The individual
we should have gone for them.
Right.
If you have a target, you should try and hit it, absolutely.
Is it good enough, Clive?
No, it's not. And I think, we have built homes, affordable homes, in the numbers that were required before, straight after, well, pretty much soon after the Second World War. Yeah. It's been done before, so we can do it again.
A long time ago, there wasn't. Successive governments have failed to do it.
You would have thought that we've learned a thing or two about that and could now do it. There's a desperate need, and the fact that there are actually more empty homes than there are homeless people in this country, in almost 250,000. So there are lots of ways that we can begin to ensure that people have an affordable roof over their head, and it should not be beyond the ken of government.
But of course, in those days, we didn't have a green belt. I mean, the green belt only really came in the kind of mid-50s in response to what was seen as huge, excessive house building.
Right, but
the situation now
not in my backyard has become such a big problem. There's more. It's not just a small problem, though, is it?
I think it is an issue, and I think successive governments of different stripes have tried to solve it, have tried to say, look, we need to build more housing, but getting it through the House has been challenging.
Right, Keir Starmer is committed to building houses. That's going to be his cornerstone. What's going to make any difference for him in terms of persuading local people that it's a good idea?
I think it's the kind of homes you're going to build. Like if you come to my city in Norwich, you'll find there are tens of thousands of people on the housing waiting list, desperate to get onto to find a council house, to get onto an affordable home. And one of the things we're talking about is building affordable homes or council housing, which I think is a fantastic thing. So not all houses are the same. Look, if you want to, houses are being built, but they're not always affordable. So let's build affordable homes that people can rent from their local authority, can rent from a housing association, and can live in a warm, secure, sustainable home. I think that's something that people will want.
Is it good enough?
No, not at all. And it's causing so many problems. It's not just the stereotypical, oh, you want young people to have a house. It's affecting the rental sector. There was a report out recently actually saying over 55s are renting and often finding themselves at the mercy of landlords. The housing crisis that we're seeing is affecting so many issues. And housing is not just confined to the basic right of having a warm, safe roof over your head. It affects productivity, it affects health, it affects, you know, the economy as well. And I do actually think, you know, Labour's had a lot of criticism for not outlining a lot of plans, but actually their plans on planning reform are quite bold, they are quite radical, and actually they've had praise from even right-wing commentators and some within the Conservative Party. I think the decision to scrap those targets was basically the government admitting that they've kind of failed on housing.
Right, I mean, it's interesting that Tory MPs, former cabinet ministers like Simon Clarke, have said unless the Conservatives actually gripped this issue, they'll lose the next generation of voters.
Well, yeah, clearly it's existential. You know, for 100 years, the most original thinkers in the Conservative Party, from Noel Skelton to Margaret Thatcher, over the course of half a century, talked about a property-owning democracy. And you can't diversify the voter base of the Conservative Party or have working class or lower middle class aspirational people voting for the Conservative Party unless they have access to capital. That's why it's such an existential problem for the Conservative Party, and ultimately that's why the Labour Party is going to have to take some very tough decisions and think strategically. And given that both Clive and Kwasi both noted the local resistance and the political resistance to this, ultimately it will require a government to stand up to backbenchers and local authorities and say, look, we've got strategic plans to build, you've had a say in drawing them up, but that's that.
But the point, I mean, you make the point very well, that you have to have a sort of property-owning democracy. That's the heart of sort of conservatism. But the issue that we've got, and the issue that Labour will get if they get into power, is what the composition of the House of Commons is.
Yes.
You've got to get stuff through the House of Commons. And if you've got a hung parliament, as we've had for quite a bit of the last...
Quasi, you had a
very big majority.
You had an 80-seat majority.
We've got an 80-seat majority now.
You've had it since 2019.
Yeah, for the last 4 years. But if you look back, we had parliaments where... Because I remember it came up when I was Minister with Theresa May.
Yes.
That very issue came up.
Right, but actually...
And we couldn't get it through the Commons.
Right, well, you're talking about the arithmetic in the House of Commons, but is 300,000 new homes a year ambitious enough? I mean, this, in story in the Daily Mail, house building must be trebled to 500,000 every year to match the demand generated by soaring immigration. Do you accept that?
So that was the other thing I was going to say. You can't talk about housing without talking about levels of immigration, because obviously if hundreds of thousands of people net are coming into the country every year, that puts more demand on housing, so you need to build more to accommodate that.
But we haven't even reached the 300,000
I just want to take the example of Norwich City Council, but my own city council. They try their best to beg, borrow and steal to build council housing, and yet they are forced to sell council houses still, and they're not allowed to get access to funding to build new homes. So if you want to leave it to the market, you know, market speculators are going to allow land values to increase before they'll build, and that's what's happening. You're going to have intervention. You're going to have to let local authorities build new affordable homes. As simple as that.
We're going to move on because we're going to talk about Labour's plan to invest £28 billion a year on green policies. It was certainly announced to great fanfare by the Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves, but the policy has changed somewhat since it was announced then in 2021. Let's have a look.
I can announce today Labour's climate investment pledge. An additional £28 billion of capital investment in our country's green transition for each and every year of this decade. We will ramp up to the £28 billion investment in the opportunities, the industries of the future, and to reduce bills.
You say you're going to ramp up. Are you still saying you will get to £28 billion, that is the plan in the first Parliament?
Yes. We will get to the £28 billion. It will be in the second half of the first Parliament.
Now, that's quite a big change, £28 billion a year if Labour win the next election, to ramping up to that figure, as she said, Rachel Reeves, to the second half of the next Parliament or first Labour term. Now, the reports at the weekend saying that Labour may not get there at all, and that to some extent contributed to confusion yesterday here on Politics Live when I was asking the same question of the Shadow Health Minister, Preet Gill. We were told Labour are committed to spending and investing up to £28 billion a year. When?
Look, the fiscal situation at the moment, as we're very clear from our Shadow Chancellor, is that the 28 billion is likely to be hit at a second term of a Labour government.
Now, Preet Gill said a second term, to which I was momentally surprised. But in fact, the Labour Party and Preet Gill both clarified after that clip yesterday that the policy is still to get to £28 billion in the second half, though, of the next Parliament. Are you disappointed?
Am I disappointed, though, it's going to be the second half of the Parliament? Well, look, I understand that the party's inheriting a terrible fiscal and financial situation in this country because of the economic mess that we've been left by this government. And that means that there will be difficulties in being able to, where you apply that money to simply the Green Prosperity Fund. We've got NHS waiting lists that have to come down. We've got schools that are crumbling. We've got people sleeping on the streets. We've got to build. So I think I understand the difficulty of it, but let's not forget that 28 billion, the Climate Change Committee says by 2030 we need to be investing £50 billion a year. Now, that 28 billion is from the public sector. Don't forget what that will crowd in from the private sector as well, which should bring that up near to the figure that the Climate Change Committee are talking
about.
Right,
but
so
Preet Gill was confused, and perhaps we can understand why. This pledge here, Labour saying they deny abandoning the £28 billion Green Pledge, but all the talk is it's being watered down. Is it going to disappear altogether?
No, I don't think so. I would always be ambitious for my party to spend more and invest more in the future of this country, in young people, in sustainable housing, in actually tackling the climate crisis. 28 billion is a starting figure. And let's just sit back for a second. If we actually have adults in charge of the economy, investing in the economy, fixing the economy, then that should be the bottom line, not necessarily the upper limit. So I'd like to think that what Labour are doing is they're committing themselves to the Green Prosperity Plan. They're actually going to invest in the future, and this is the starting point. So I'm pleased with that, but I would always expect more.
Right. Should Clive be worried?
Look, I think clearly Labour are still committed to the principle of green investment. I think it's notable the shift that's happened since Rachel Reeves gave that speech in 2021. In May, I wrote a piece for The Times saying if the 28 billion pledge in the form it existed in then, i.e. we will spend 28 billion a year, survived all the way until election, something fundamental would have changed in British politics. And it hasn't, because this is a Labour leadership that's clearly, justifiably, very, very wary about charges of profligacy. I think the line you hear when Labour people deny that the 28 billion is being watered down is sort of having it all ways. We're still committed to reaching 28 billion, but our fiscal rules are paramount and every policy is subject to that. So that means one of two things. One, that the 28 billion might not ever be reached because of those fiscal rules, or two, Labour is going to do something creative with the fiscal rules and say, look, borrowing to invest is clearly a different kind of borrowing because it's going to generate the growth we need. I think it's probably in that latter category, but clearly Rachel Reeves and others are going to be very, very nervous about saying so when CCHQ and the Conservative front bench are going to say, you're going to borrow 28 billion more. Same old Labour.
Some of this doubt, though, has led the government to be very keen, let's put it this way, to talk about Labour's pledge. Let's have a look.
Much as I like her as a person, I disagree with Rachel Reeves wanting to borrow an extra £28 billion a year. That would push up mortgage rates.
There is no way that you can borrow that amount of money and tell the British people that that is not going to have an impact on inflation, on interest rates, and ultimately on their taxes. It's as simple as that.
They've got no idea what they're doing about borrowing. They're saying they're going to bring it up.
Right.
It is fiscal irresponsibility on steroids.
Do you agree with... Well, hang on. I just want to get... I mean, it's a bit rich when your mini budget involved £45 billion of borrowing.
To be fair to them, I mean, they came into power in response to the mini budget, and they're saying we can't go down the route of fiscal expansion, and we've got to be very cautious. But of course, the one word we haven't mentioned in any of it, well, Clive did, I think, once, is growth. You've got to have a growth plan.
Yeah, but you know it's been revised down for this year and for next year.
Actually, of course it has been. But my view is that you've got to do something. As I tried to do, Liz Truss tried to do, you've got to do something to get growth going, and it's not good enough just to say, well, we're not going to invest in the British economy.
Right.
We're going to allow everything to crumble, and we're just going to,
But do you accept that? I mean, that sounds like an acceptance that actually what you and Liz Truss did in that mini budget that did involve that vast amount of borrowing has led to timidity, not from Clive, but on Labour's side when it comes to borrowing.
I think it's a natural thing. Once you go down one route and you see it not working, to overcompensate. Now, I think whoever, sorry, Clive,
That's what I was saying.
I think whoever gets in, it's not a done deal that Labour will get in, but if whoever does get in will have to revisit the growth plan. And the second part of that is that once you have a growth plan, you're going to have some green investment. Because it doesn't make sense in the 2020s to have a growth plan without a serious plan on environment and net zero.
Right. I mean, do you blame Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss for perhaps Labour wobbling slightly, being overcautious on borrowing?
It's possible. I mean, I'm not going to blame him, but we can make our own decisions. But it's quite clear that if you accept the orthodox structures of how an economy works and what the mainstream Westminster analysis of debt and how the economy works, if you're going to accept that, then you limit yourself within those constraints. But I would argue that for the last 13 years, we've had public sector, investment in the public sector smashed. We've had austerity. Well, it is true in real terms. In terms of austerity has damaged the prospects for a whole generation of people. We need to move away from that. And we either accept that the climate crisis is an existential threat for which we have to prepare ourselves, or we don't. And this government clearly doesn't, and Labour
If you look
does.
at public spending, the actual reality is that public spending has gone up hugely in the last 13 years. So when I was elected in 2010,
in cash terms,
it was
it has gone
700.
up.
No, in real terms as well.
Not massively.
No, in real terms, it's gone up.
terms.
So if you look at what the amount we were spending through COVID, we spent 300 billion to support the economy. Yeah. So as Chancellor last year, we were spending £1 trillion for the first time ever, £1 trillion a year. And when I was elected, I think we were spending 700 billion. So nominally, it's gone up a huge amount. And even in real terms, if you factor in inflation, it's gone up. So it's not true to say that we've smashed public spending.
Well, I'm looking at my constituents. I'm looking at young people. I'm looking at Sure Start centres. I'm looking at the NHS waiting list. I'm looking at the reality of what my constituents are facing now, which is many of them is destitution. Many of them are in rent arrears. Many of them are struggling to heat their homes, Kwasi. And it's because of 13 years of this government and an economic philosophy and an economic orthodoxy which has led us to this point.
OK, so you made a point about spending, which isn't true. It's not the case that we've cut spending. Even in real terms, spending has gone up. Now we can discuss.
It's gone up more slowly.
We can discuss
and compared to our economic competitors.
We can discuss, and you talk about economic competitors. The actual reality, we go, we've got to stay in the EU. We're growing faster than Germany, France, and Italy.
But it just depends. It depends which period. It depends.
What's incredible is we're being lectured by you on economic policy. I mean, that's what's incredible.
No. It's incredible when people say that we're doing worse than our European partners, when in fact we're doing better.
Well, hang on. It does depend which statistic you pick, and it does depend which period of time. But if we look at the figures, well, let me just ask you before I get Aisha to respond. In terms of the budget that we've just had, or the autumn statement, I should say, did you agree with those tax cuts?
I did agree with them.
Right, even though the option could have been to put more money into public services.
I think you're not going to grow the economy by simply increasing taxation. That is not the way to grow an economy.
But when you invest in public services, you are investing in the economy. That goes into the multiplier effect. It goes into the economy and it creates more tax returns. There are two different economic realities here, aren't there? The tax-cutting reality, which Liz Truss and yourself pursued, which has left us where we are, or the policy of investing in people.
But where are you going to get the money from? You're going to basically tax people more.
Well, you can tax wealth. We've looked at that.
But your party isn't going to do that either.
At the moment, it isn't, but it may have to.
But that's what you
may have to. Let me let Aisha in. She's been desperate to come in.
I do find this extraordinary. I mean, I do admire your chutzpah, Kwasi. It is, getting lectures on the economy from you guys, particularly you and, of course, Liz Truss. It's like getting advice on social care from Harold Shipman. It really feels completely...
I'm sorry.
No, but I'm sorry. You've got to admit, you guys...
Harold Shipman, the metaphor... I get the point you're making, but I think the metaphor...
The economy.
I think the metaphor is slightly
hundreds of pounds on
inappropriate.
people's mortgages. You've probably cost your party the next general election. You gifted Labour the mantle of fiscal responsibility. In terms of austerity, money has gone up towards the end of your time because of COVID, but also money has had to go in because of austerity. So many services were hollowed out. You look at what's happened with the police. We have got such an issue now, and a lot of that is because David Cameron said, I'm turning people back to their departments until they come back with more cuts. And all of those cuts to policing, we're really, really paying a price for.
All right.
In terms of Labour's point, Look,
well, let me let Kwasi come back, and
Yeah,
I'll come back
okay,
to you on
fine.
Labour's point. But Kwasi, do you want to respond to what you've just heard from?
Yeah, I didn't think the Harold Shipman metaphor.
No, I
was
get that, but
inappropriate.
more broadly.
I think in terms of the interest rates, I mean, that was clearly something which is determined by the Bank of England's interest rate policy. That's something that was gone up. I think it was 0.1% 2 years ago. The base
Sorry,
rate. Now it's
are you
500.
saying that your mini budget had nothing
No,
to
I'm
do
not
with
saying it
people's
didn't. But I'm just saying
mortgages
that
getting pulled
today,
and going up?
today, if you're paying on a tracker mortgage, it's obviously based on the Bank of England, and interest rates were going up across the world.
But are you not
in terms
taking
of the
any
central bank.
responsibility?
I'm taking some responsibility.
Would
I'm
you
saying
apologise to people?
I've apologised on Piers Morgan. I've apologised so many different times. I've said we went too fast. I think we went too fast. I think you've got to have a measure of spending restraint, not cuts, but restraint of growth. I've said all these things many times publicly.
Right. Patrick?
Well, look, I think Kwasi has made the best defence for the 28 billion that I've actually ever heard, which is
Yeah.
that without the 28
Yes,
billion or
without
something
growth.
like it, and Clive makes a very good point about fiscal orthodoxy and how that's a confining, constraining thing for the political imagination. Without the two issues we've spoken about this morning, big planning reform and green investment, Labour's economic cupboard is completely bare.
Right. I mean, Kwasi, just hearing
I was
Patrick
surprised
say
to hear
that.
that.
Do you think it's a good policy, the
Look,
28 billion
the
pounds a year?
fundamental issue, because I was a net zero minister. I mean, that was my
Yeah.
I was an energy
Yeah,
minister,
so
that was my
perhaps
thing.
you do.
And what I actually think is that if you look at the EU, if you look at the US, they are investing billions in what we call the energy transition. You can call it net zero, you can call it the energy transition. And at some point, the UK will have to have a response to that. And I've always believed
on that...
So it's a good policy?
No, I think what they're saying, to put a number on it, is crazy, because they don't know what the actual books are going to, what the figures are going to be.
No, but I think...
I think you do have to accept that if you're going to do the energy transition properly, you're going to have to, and that's what we've been doing for the last.
But this is more. It's more.
I think you just made an important. I mean, you don't want to bring yourself to say it's a good policy. It is a good policy, and one of the reasons why it's a good policy is that business is crying out for it, because we're talking about growth, and one thing that all parties want is the pursuit of growth. You wanted the pursuit of growth. Labour does as well. And this green stuff is not just the right thing to do for climate change. It is absolutely one of the key sectors that can stimulate.
But can anyone find the growth fairy?
But look. You can. If you want to go and open up new oil fields, you can have lots of that growth. But it's the wrong kind.
They are doing that.
And it's the wrong kind of growth, because it's planet-destroying growth. Look, if you think what the Americans are calling, they're calling it the Inflation Reduction Act. And there's an understanding that what is happening is that globalisation is falling apart, that they are trying to build their own supply chains in a continental way in the United States or nearabouts, because they understand that as the world begins to fragment, their country is going to need, or their continent is going to need the capacity to be self-sufficient. And this is something that the European Union is now is working on. Yeah. It's something that this country, the United Kingdom, now it's out of the EU, also needs to start thinking about, because global Britain sounds great, but the reality is globalisation is changing rapidly and collapsing in. So we need to invest in the future, invest in electronic chips, invest in renewables, invest in renewable energy. But you've not done it on the scale that's required. And now you've got ministers coming out trashing the limited 28 billion. That's good. We need more than that. We need to invest in the future of our people.
So I think you're right, okay? I think you're right fundamentally to say the EU are investing in the energy transition, the US is investing in the energy transition, and whoever wins the next general election will have to have a plan for investing.
Do you think Labour should stick to their guns then?
But we've been doing this. We've been doing this. I'm just, before he trashes what we've been doing, we've had offshore wind was a record development. We've developed 10 gigawatts, which is a huge amount, supplies up to 30% a day of our electricity today, when 10 years ago it was zero. And actually, you mentioned a good phrase earlier when you said we're crowding in. And so for every pound the government pays, there's a lot of private investment that comes in.
Right.
That is working in the UK. People look to the UK as a leader in the energy transition. But we're going to have to, forgive me, accelerate that.
But they're complaining. But businesses are complaining at the moment that the government U-turns on renewable energy and on its green policies are causing instability in the market. They don't know where they should be investing. Should they be investing in oil, or should they be investing in solar and renewables? Clearly, many of them want to invest in solar and renewables and other green areas. So if you listen to businesses, and we have been listening to businesses, they're saying we want some stability.
Well, you've mentioned businesses.
Long-term investment in the economy.
You've mentioned businesses. I don't want to pile on the grief on Kwasi, but this clip from Lisa Wilkinson, the former chair of Wilco, talking yesterday about the collapse of her company. Let's have a listen.
During 2022, we were trying to move from a revolving credit facility, which we didn't use, but to a more secured debt position. We were about to enter into secured lending arrangements with Macquarie when the 2022 mini budget happened. Literally, we were in the midst of that. And at that point, the interest terms on that loan were hiked massively, and that became infeasible. And so that was a contributor.
Do you feel in any way responsible for the collapse? She said it was a contributor.
Lots of businesses had to deal with that. They had their own issues, OK? So I understand she was a manager of a business that's failed, and she's blaming government policy. I totally get that. But there were also issues with the actual management of the company which needed to be addressed. It wasn't a particularly well-run business. I can see why she wants to blame external circumstances, but I think that she was responsible for a failed company ultimately.
I mean, 12,000 jobs did go as a result. I suppose that's a real-life consequence, one of the real-life consequences. And I suppose there's still a question mark around the issue of big amounts of borrowing, Clive, and the consequences it could have.
So you've used the term borrowing, and it is, but I see it as an investment in people, an investment in the future. I remember I was at Parliament a little while ago. A group of young people came in, and we were talking about climate issues. And I said to them, what would you rather be left with, debt or a climate crisis that you cannot cope with? And it was debt. And look, what is debt? Debt is an investment in people, it's an investment in homes, it's an investment in productive capacity,
But the
it's
point
an investment in us.
Yes.
That's what
Although
it is.
we're talking about 12,000 job losses there. The problem is if the markets respond and don't trust you...
But that is the key point there, Joe. What Kwasi and Liz did was they spooked the markets because it came out of nowhere. This plan from Labour has been out there for a long, long time. The markets know about it. They're not spooked about it. In fact, as Kwasi's made an argument, it's happening in America, it's happening in Europe, and businesses are... So the market has actually priced this in as part of a plan for growth. The difference with the mini-budget was that it came out of nowhere and it spooked everyone.
We're going to talk about reparative justice and whether those responsible for slavery should make good for their historic wrongs. I'm joined from New York by Laura Trevelyan, a former BBC journalist who is the descendant of a slave-owning family. Hello to you, Laura. Just explain
Morning, Jo.
To our viewers about your ancestors, George and Harriet Trevelyan, and what you have decided to do.
Well, like many people in Britain, including, I will say, the new Foreign Secretary, David Cameron, who has distant relatives who were involved in some way in the slave trade, I discovered in 2016, thanks to University College London, that ancestors of mine received compensation, if you can believe it, when slavery was abolished back in 1833. It wasn't the enslaved Africans who got compensation at abolition, it was the slave owners, because in a classic political compromise, it was the only way to get support for abolition. But this information was hidden from my generation, from the generation above. And we began to ask in the family, what does it mean? A process which really accelerated after Black Lives Matter. And the BBC, Joe, in the fine tradition, let me go last year to make a documentary in Grenada to ask what are the legacies of slavery in Grenada today? And I discovered that there are so many, from ill health to underinvestment to the fact that these islands are really at risk from climate change, people who never asked to be there. And so when I came back, working with Caribbean leaders and thinking about it, people really said to me, if you apologise and your family apologises for what your ancestors did to us and do something reparative like invest in education, it will set an example.
All right, what's your connection, Clive, to Laura?
So my dad is Grenadian, and my dad now has gone back to the UK, has gone back to Grenada. He lives a very short distance away from where one of the plantations that Laura's family owned. It's highly likely that my family, according to historians, were owned by Laura's ancestors, so that's our connection.
Right, and you have worked together on a podcast, Heirs of Enslavement.
That's right, available on all good
yes, I've listened to two of the episodes yesterday.
You know, look, this is about a conversation. It's about how the past informs the present. And it's also a story about how wealth was created. A big part of the wealth of this country was created and is still created. The Caribbean, one of the most indebted parts of the world, every 60 cents, every dollar that Grenada generates, it goes back in debt repayments to banks and financial institutions. So there is still a legacy to this very day. And although it's often framed as as money for slavery, compensation for slavery. Actually, it's a longer story. It's about what's going on to this very day, the apartheid that happened after the abolition of slavery. It's an interesting story about who we are as a country.
I mean, what you and Laura have done, and what Laura has done in terms of paying £100,000, that's one family. That's one family story. But you both want to see the UK government, for example, look at the issue of paying reparations.
I think so. And I think it's not just us. I think if you listen to the smoke signals coming from the King, I think he's also interested in the conversation around this issue. He obviously has already spoken through his goddaughter to say that he feels this is an issue that should be taught in our schools, just in the way that the Holocaust is. There are things that we need to learn and understand about what happened during this period, which, frankly, we've kind of airbrushed over. Basically, the story is we had slaves for a little bit, then we freed them, and then we stopped other people from having it. It's a bit more complicated than that. And when you look at that history, it begins to inform and tell you about where wealth is now, who has it, and how they acquired it. And if you want to be able to do things on this and to make reparatory justice, then that's a conversation we in this country could have.
Do you agree with that, Laura?
I think, look, the Caribbean has a 10-point plan for reparative justice. Caribbean governments came up with it 10 years ago. They've asked Britain's government and the other former colonial powers to sit down and negotiate on the basis of it. It begins with an apology for slavery, that plan. The ask is for investment in health and education, areas that were woefully, zero funding at the abolition of slavery. And then when these islands became independent, they also got basically zero from Britain's government. And the other ask is for debt forgiveness. And the other thing that will come up this week at COP28 is the issue of climate resiliency funding. The Caribbean is so at risk from climate change. So, Britain has a moral responsibility to open discussions with the Caribbean on the basis of its reparations plan.
Right, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment. Should the UK government pay reparations?
No, look, I think I agree with 90% of what Clive said. I think you've got to have a debate.
An apology?
I think the history, possibly an apology, but what I think is the wrong route is to simply say we're going to have reparations for such and such. We give billions to countries in the aid budget. We support countries in the Commonwealth and other countries in development. But to say, how would you quantify it? How would you... And the other thing that I have a real issue with, from a kind of almost philosophical point of view, is this idea that if your 10th generation plus ancestor did something, you're somehow responsible. That bit I find very difficult. And I think most people will find very difficult.
Right. Well, Laura, can you answer that?
Well, I think it's the wider question, isn't it, that Britain profited from slavery. Britain is a G7 country today, despite the cost of living crisis, because in part the Industrial Revolution was fueled by the profits of slavery. That's the history of 19th century Britain. And the Caribbean, the history there is of underinvestment.
Right.
And yes, you can say slavery began 400 years ago and it was abolished 190 years ago, but you see the legacies today. So the question is, Britain has a moral responsibility to the Caribbean to help it get to the same level.
I agree with the moral
So
responsibility.
what does Britain do now?
But Laura, we spend more of our wealth, and even at 0.5%, than most other Western countries. We spend a huge amount in DFID. We spend a huge amount in our aid budget. We're very committed to building relationships and supporting people all over the world.
Yes.
We're driving climate, the fight against climate change.
To the loss and damage fund that's coming up at COP28.
And I think we are committed.
Islands with climate resiliency.
Well, that's going to be part of the negotiation in COP.
But climate change is an existential threat now to the Caribbean.
But that's something
Nobody asked to be in the Caribbean. Their ancestors were brought there by British enslavers. So this is a pressing question for this moment. And as Clive and I saw during our podcast, there's just massive underinvestment in roads, in education, in health in the Caribbean.
Of course.
This all goes back to not a nail shall be made in the colonies.
Sure. Just before I continue, I'm interested in what Kwasi was putting to Laura. Why do you feel shame? You used the word shame in one of the episodes of the podcast. Why do you feel shame directly? These are your ancestors.
I don't feel any guilt. I mean, just to be clear, I don't feel any guilt. And I agree with Kwasi that you can't personally be held responsible. I don't feel responsible for what happened, but I do feel a sense of shame about it. I do recognise that my own position today, 190 years after abolition, that there's some social privilege that comes with the wealth that was accumulated with slavery. But no, I'm not suggesting that people should give up their homes because they're descended from enslavers at all. I'm saying that Britain's government should sit down with the Caribbean and begin the discussion on the basis of the 10-point plan. And I hope that I can set some kind of an example there.
I think one of the things I've been very clear about is that this conversation isn't about making anyone feel guilty, anyone feel ashamed. It's about understanding our past and coming to terms with it.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's a fair point.
Yeah, I think it's not. And I think the thing about 0.5% of GDP being spent on an overseas aid budget is that you have to understand one of the key reasons why we are the 6th largest economy in the world, why we have the City of London and the massive financial institutions. Its genesis was the transatlantic slave trade and the empire, which then enriched it afterwards.
There were lots of elements to it.
That's right. And we are still then extracting from those, from many of those countries. So 0.5%, when you think about the GDP that we have globally, is a very, very small fraction, given what we did to those countries and continue to do in keeping them in debt.
Laura Trevelyan, thank you very much for talking to us about heirs of enslavement and your connection with Clive. Patrick, you wanted to say something in response to what you'd heard.
Well, no, I think a lot of the debate we just had was couched in moral or philosophical terms. I think Clive started talking about economics towards the end. I think that's the key point. There is a political case for doing this because at every Commonwealth summit you get these calls for reparations. And where will Commonwealth countries who've been affected by this issue look for investment if it's not to the West? And this is causing diplomatic issues. They'll look to China, which causes huge geopolitical problems. And 100%. If we're now looking at where we're getting critical minerals from, which we'll talk about in a minute when we talk about COP and climate, clearly it's in the political and economic interests to smooth diplomatic relations. And if the call is for reparations, that, as Clive said, are for a fairly small proportion of GDP, then there's a strong political case for doing that.
How do you quantify? It's very a family giving an amount of money is one thing. Laura doing £100,000, you could question why not more or less. But governments, where would it end?
Look, I think the idea of how you quantify it is a legitimate question, and there are differing views as well from speaking to different people about this. But to take it back, I mean, I've seen Clive and Laura do things together. I actually found it very moving because this has sort of never been done before, and it's done in a way which is not about you pointing your finger and shouting at Laura. It's an adult, modern conversation which looks to the future and looks to the past. I think what we have got to do as a country is we've got to stop this being a kind of big culture war. It's not that... To love Britain is to know about Britain's history as well. Look, we sit here as a very, very diverse panel from all parts.
But no one's debating that.
There will be people, Kwasi, watching telly right now saying, why are you even talking about this? There are some, even within the Conservative Party, who go mad every time there's a conversation about looking at the National Trust. So we've got to have a healthy, honest conversation. I'm from India. I didn't even know about really what happened with the East Indian Company until really the Empire podcast. We have got to do much more education. That's not to say that's about pointing the finger at blame, but we've got to have a much more comfortable conversation about our past in this country.
So a comfortable conversation, an informed conversation, I think most people, not everybody, but most people, 85%, whatever, would agree with. I think where it becomes culture war-y is when people start tearing down statues or essentially trying to cancel people or perceived to essentially be very intolerant. And, I mean, Clive is far too well-mannered to do this, but there is a lot of finger-pointing in the debate. There is a lot of people saying, you should feel guilty, you did something that was terrible. And, of course, that breeds a counter-reaction from the people who are having their fingers pointed at.
I think the point that's being made, though, is that if this conversation isn't happening, and there are people who are trying to contain it, and I think...
And would you like the Labour Party to
we want it to be opened out. We want people to have this conversation, because I think it's a healing conversation.
Yeah, so I agree with that. So, look, I'm someone I've written books about empire, and I find it fascinating, and I want it to be taught more. I think there should be a broader debate. I think people should talk about enslavement, they should talk about the slave trade, they should talk about all of these things. But it does get very heated when people start, blaming people. I'm not saying anyone around this table is blaming anyone, or Laura or whoever, but there are people who are very militant about it, and that just creates the kind of culture war argument and the hostility.
Well, let me just point you to something else that you said, because we've been talking about COP28, the climate conference. Kwasi Kwarteng says in Politics Home, COP28 should not bully developing countries to net zero. You said Britain and the Western world must ensure action and dialogue to tackle climate change does not become part of a neo-colonial bubble that bullies these countries. What do you mean?
So what I meant was, if you talk about climate change or net zero in Angola, as I've done, or in parts of Africa, they will say, what are you doing? You essentially industrialised on the back of fossil fuels, and you're telling us that we can't do the same. You're keeping us poor by saying that the way in which we got rich cannot be allowed to them. So you're saying it's all very well for us to have been burning coal for 300 years, but actually you guys should come off coal and spend a lot more of your money on renewables.
Right.
And that's how they perceive the argument.
But if we are going to buy into loss and damage, into technology transfers, into actually supporting these economies to make the jump over fossil fuels, then it isn't bullying, it's supporting those countries to meet their net zero commitments.
I agree.
But if we're simply wagging our finger and lecturing them,
and there's a fine line here. A lot of the conversation that you see in the West is very much from a position of moral superiority. We're saying we care about the climate and we want to stop burning fossil fuels, and everyone else should do the same. And that's why it's perceived as neocolonialism.
I mean, how do you achieve net zero globally? I mean, you know, it's hard enough here.
It's really difficult, and you look at the statistics, and the climate is getting hotter. You know, even people are now saying this 1.5 degrees. We may have to move away from that. We may well have missed it. Sure, yeah. I think there is a point in what Kwasi is saying in terms of, you know, we've just talked about our past. Let's not kid ourselves. One of the reasons Britain became so fantastically wealthy, and other Western countries, is because of the Industrial Revolution. So in a way, we've kind of, you know, we put in our pollution quite early, and now that there are other countries saying, well, hang on a minute, you've had your chance to grow, why not give us ours? So I think tone is very, very important. But I'd say two things. I think if we are going to sort of try and be leaders, I think things like the decision on rowing back on some of the net zero sends a conflicting message. And the second thing is, a lot of these countries are going to be more affected by climate change in terms of natural disaster, flood. That's going to contribute to migration. So I think we have to try and help. I know that sounds a bit patronizing, but we've all got to sort of try and do it together.
But the politics of this have meant that Rishi Sunak thought there was an opportunity, let me put it like that, to say we'll still get to net zero by 2050, but we're not going to put the same sort of financial pressures on people here.
Well, look, what is the thread that links all of the stories we've talked about today, the 28 billion and now Rishi Sunak's decision on net zero? It is the conflict between the short-termist Westminster incentives and the long-term what's good for the economy and look.
But you're a very distinguished political correspondent. You know, as I do, as everyone does, the reason why we went slightly, and I don't think it's that conflicted, but we've gone back a little bit on the net zero, was the Uxbridge by-election. I mean,
of course, that's what I'm saying.
That was a situation where there was an issue on ULEZ.
But to take one by-election,
I mean, was that
change your whole policy on that?
So look at the polls. They haven't moved, so it clearly hasn't worked. I mean,
So it was self-defeating?
Well, it's not self-defeating, but I understand there's a portion of the electorate that's and many people watching this programme, I suppose, are very sceptical about net zero. They see that there are huge costs.
Well, who's going to pay for it?
And the Prime Minister said, obviously net zero is an issue, but we're not going to do that on the back of increased costs for people.
But this is the key thing about one of the things that isn't discussed about when we talk about net zero is who is going to pay for this? And there are so many of my constituents, so many people who are watching this programme who can't afford to give up carbon, that they actually need to consume a little bit more of it. So this is about redistribution as well within that pie, because that's something we're not talking about. Who is doing most of the consumption? We know it's the middle and the 1% who are doing most of the consumption of carbon. So that means there needs to be a redistribution of that carbon and a redistribution of that wealth.
Let's just go into the chamber. Prime Minister's questions coming up in a few moments' time with the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, and the leader of the opposition, Keir Starmer. Yesterday, there were scenes of a number of Tory backbenchers complaining, angry, upset about the net migration figures that have hit a record high. Do you sympathise with them?
Yeah, I think, I mean, those of us who were elected in 2010, where we had in our manifesto tens of thousands, are obviously going to be concerned when you see a net figure of 745,000. And I can understand why they're concerned.
Right, but why have successive governments failed to get even close to a target?
I mean, a lot of this is to do with the nature of the economic growth that we have seen. So contrary to common belief, we haven't simply just flatlined. The economy has grown, and a lot of that, the economy, a modern economy, needs people coming in and providing vital services. And there's always a balance. There's always a balance between keeping very safe, secure borders and also allowing people to come in to contribute economically. But the government's failed,
haven't they? I mean, the government has failed to do what it has pledged to do in successive manifestos. And in 2019, it was, again, bring down the overall numbers of net migration. Is that still desirable?
Yes, it is. Of course it is. And the Prime Minister said that himself. And I think this, and we talked about the economy, I think this is the single most challenging issue for the Conservative Party going into the next election. Because, and we haven't mentioned them at all, but there is a Reform, Nigel Farage, all those sort of people are totally going to focus on this issue. We just had an election in Holland where this was the central issue. And what happened was that the centre-right party started talking about immigration. And of course, the far-right, the party to the right of them, benefited from that conversation. So this is a very difficult issue. And I think it's probably, I'd say, probably the most challenging issue.
And we've had Darren Jones saying that the right number is probably around 250,000. Do you agree?
This is like picking a figure out the air. The right number is what the economy needs. Look, we have an aging population. Look at the United States. By 2050, 300 million people will be over 65. There's actually going to be a fight for younger people from the global south in the coming decades. Well, this is the thing that links. This is the thing that links all the conversations between climate, between reparations, and having a conversation about our past, which then informs and colours our approaches and attitudes to immigration. So we need to kind of link them all together.
But your policy is essentially an open door policy.
No, it's not an open door. It's not an open door policy. It's a humane policy, and there's a difference there. But if you're going to have an adult social care system where you starve local authorities of the ability to pay people properly, but allow some of those private providers of care homes to be able to pay 20% less to them, of course they're going to, and give visas, of course they're going to suck in people. Why not bring adult social care, as an example, back under public control, invest in it properly, pay people decent wages, and you will see people flocking to adult social care. So if you want to have stable numbers, have a humane immigration policy, pay people decent wages, train people in this country, and then have a policy on immigration which is humane, help those countries jump over their sustainability issues on the environment and do that.
You've talked a lot.
But no, but there is a way to do this.
It's a very simple issue. You either have an open door policy or you have a control policy where you have to limit it by numbers. You haven't mentioned numbers. You don't think that that's. You said it's picking numbers.
Because the numbers will.
You do have to have.
The numbers depend on what happens within the economy. So there's no point. We've talked. Look, our party is talking about a points-based system. That's what it's doing. A points-based system which looks at what the economy needs at the same time as having a humane asylum and immigration system.
$1 million
the two,
people, you would be happy with that. If the economy needed 1 million net migration,
well, if you're
going to have to stop you in a moment.
Services and you needed 1 million people because people are in their 70s, who is going to wipe your bottom, Kwasi? So that's the issue.
Well, on that note, let's go to Prime Minister's questions.
Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Gavin Newlands. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Last year, Scotland exported 19 trillion watt-hours of electricity worth £4 billion to the UK grid. Yet not only do Scottish generators pay the highest grid connection charges in Europe, Scots pay amongst the highest standing charges, whilst London is by far the lowest. Our heating and lighting is switched on a lot earlier and off a lot later than the south of England. So should Scottish households be forced to shiver in the dark this winter to subsidise the richest part of the UK?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, as the honourable member will know, standing charges are a matter for Ofgem, the independent regulator. Last week they did launch a consultation asking for views about standing charges, and he'll know, because of geographic factors, the UK government already provides an annual cross-subsidy worth £60 to a typical household in Scotland. But on top of that, we are providing considerable support to everyone across the UK with their energy bills this year.
Smith.
Mr. Speaker, Abigail Moore Eden is 4 years old. Released from Hamas captivity last weekend, Abigail is an orphan after her parents were brutally executed in front of her during Hamas's rampage on the 7th of October. To secure the freedom of Abigail and some other hostages, Israel is taking a huge risk, releasing convicted terrorists, including would-be suicide bomber Isra Jabis, imprisoned for detonating a gas cylinder in her car in 2015. Hamas also seem to have broken the ceasefire, activating 3 explosive devices. So what steps is my rightable friend, the Prime Minister, taking to continue his welcome, steadfast support for Israel in its fight not only against Hamas, but other Iran-backed terror groups?
Prime Minister. Well, can I thank my honourable friend for raising such an important issue in my House, and my thoughts, and I know the thoughts of the whole House, will be with Abigail. As I've said before, we support Israel's right to defend itself, to go after Hamas and to free hostages, to deter further incursions and to strengthen its security for the long term. We welcome, though, the extension to the agreement to pause fighting, increase humanitarian aid and release further hostages. Negotiations are ongoing and highly sensitive, but this has been a welcome first positive step. We will continue also to hold Iran to account, Mr. Speaker, for any further escalation from these groups, as well as continuing to work with partners to disrupt and deter Iran's destabilising activities in the Middle East.
I now call on the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In an effort to hide from his failures, the Prime Minister spent this week arguing about an ancient relic that only a tiny minority of the British public have any interest in. Mr. Speaker, that's enough about the Tory party. In 2019, they all promised the country that they would control immigration, numbers will come down, the British people will be in control. How's it going?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, let me be crystal clear. The levels of migration are far too high, and I'm determined to bring them back down to sustainable levels. That's why we've asked the Migration Advisory Council to review certain elements of the system. We're reviewing those findings and we'll bring forward next steps. But earlier this year, we announced the toughest action ever taken to reduce legal migration. The effects of that action are yet to be felt, that will impact 150,000 student dependents, and forecasts show that migration is likely to drop as a result. But all we've heard up until this moment from the honourable gentleman on this topic is a secret backroom deal with the EU that would see an additional 100,000 migrants here every year.
Mr. Speaker, never mind the British Museum. It's the Prime Minister who's obviously lost his marbles. Mr. Speaker, the Greek Prime Minister came to London to meet him, a fellow NATO member, an economic ally, one of our most important partners in tackling illegal immigration. But instead of using that meeting to discuss those serious issues, he tried to humiliate him and cancelled at the last minute. Why such small politics, Prime Minister?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, of course, we're always happy to discuss important topics of substance with our allies, like tackling illegal migration or indeed strengthening our security. But when it was clear that the purpose of a meeting was not to discuss substantive issues for the future, but rather to grandstand and relitigate issues of the past, it wasn't appropriate. But furthermore, when specific commitments and specific assurances on that topic were made to this country and then were broken, it may seem alien to him, but my view is when people make commitments, they should keep them.
Mr. Speaker, I discussed with the Greek Prime Minister the economy, security, immigration. I also told him we wouldn't change the law regarding the marbles. It's not that difficult, Prime Minister. The reality is simple. He has no plan on boat crossings, and migration is at a record high. His policy is that companies can pay workers from abroad 20% less than British workers. That has contributed to those record-high immigration levels, hasn't it?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, he talks about the boat crossings. He's failed to notice illegal boat crossings are down by a third this year, Mr. Speaker, thanks to every one of the actions that we've taken that he opposed every single time they were raised. But look, Mr. Speaker, no one will be surprised that he's backing an EU country over Britain. Just this last week he was asked, he was asked which song best sums up the Labour Party. What did he come up with? Well, Mr. Speaker, he showed his true colours and chose Ode to Joy, literally the anthem of the European Union. And he will back Brussels over Britain every single time.
So let me get this straight. The Prime Minister is now saying that meeting the Prime Minister of Greece is somehow supporting the EU instead of discussing serious issues. He's just got dug further into that hole that he's made for himself. And ever, rather than deal with the facts, he's prosecuting his one-man war on reality. And that reality is stuck. Under this government, a bricklayer from overseas can be paid £2,500 less than somebody who's already here. A plasterer, £3,000 less. An engineer, £6,000 less. The list goes on. It's absurd. Labour would scrap his perverse wage-cutting policy. Why won't he?
Mr. Speaker, as I said, we have taken significant measures and will bring forward more. And indeed, as the ONS themselves said, more recent estimates indicate a slowing of immigration as a result of the things that we're doing. But I am surprised, Mr. Speaker, to hear him now taking this new position, because I've got a quote here from a pushy young shadow immigration minister who said, and I directly quote this person, he told this House that limits on skilled migrants are, and I quote, a form of economic vandalism. Who could possibly have taken such a bizarre position to only then U-turn? It will come as no surprise to anybody that it was him.
Mr. Speaker, there's only one party that's lost control of the borders, and they're sitting right there. And this is a government not just in turmoil, in open revolt. The Immigration Minister thinks the Prime Minister is failing because apparently nobody will listen to his secret plan. The former Home Secretary thinks he's failing because of his magical thinking. The current Home Secretary thinks he's failing. He even took time out of his busy schedule insulting people in the North East to admit he agrees with Labour. The Prime Minister seems to be the only person on the Tory benches without his own personal immigration plan. Clearly, his own side don't have any faith in him. Why should the public?
Mr. Speaker, it's really a bit rich to hear about this from someone who described all immigration law as racist, who literally said it was a mistake to control immigration. We have taken steps and we will take further steps, which is why recent estimates of immigration show that it's slowing. It's why next year the immigration health surcharge will increase by over 2/3. It's why immigration fees are going up by up to 35%. But, Mr. Speaker, one of his own members of his front bench said that having a target isn't sensible. Right? It's no surprise, Mr. Speaker, to have people like this, because this is the person, Mr. Speaker, while we're taking all these measures that he opposed, this is the person who stood on a platform and promised to defend free movement.
On their watch, migration has just trebled. And he's giving the House a lecture about targets. He's lost in La La Land. There can be few experiences more haunting for the members opposite than hearing this Prime Minister claim that he's going to sort out a problem. First, he said he'd get the NHS waiting list down. They went up. Unabashed by that, he said he'd get control of immigration. It's gone up. Following that experience, he turned his hand to bringing taxes down. And, would you believe it, the tax burden is now going to be higher than ever. It is ironic that he's suddenly taken such a keen interest in Greek culture when he's clearly become the man with the reverse Midas touch. Everything he touches turns to... maybe the Home Secretary could help me out here. Rubbish. So will the Prime Minister do the country a favour? We'll have to check the tape again, Mr Speaker, I think. So will the Prime Minister do the country a favour, warn us what he's planning next, so we can prepare ourselves for the disaster that will inevitably follow?
Mr Speaker, at the beginning of the year, we said, Mr Speaker...
Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, at the beginning of the year, we said we would halve inflation, and this government has delivered, easing the burden on the cost of living for families everywhere. But we know his plans, Mr Speaker, all the way through that. What did he do? Back inflationary pay rises. He talked about welfare, no controls for welfare, and borrowing £28 billion a year that would just make the situation worse. He mentioned tax, Mr Speaker. Just this past week, we've delivered the biggest tax cuts since the 1980s for millions of people and businesses, increased pensions and benefits, and this week secured £30 billion of new investment for this country. So he can keep trying, Mr Speaker, to talk...
Can I just say to the Shadow Foreign Secretary... order! Just a little bit quieter, please. I want to hear. Right, Manchester.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The government has rightly responded to the shocking and unacceptable rise in anti-Semitism, and we saw extra funding in the autumn statement. I note that 44% of religiously aggravated motivated offences last year were against the Muslim community. Yet there was no funding in the autumn statement to deal with Islamophobia. The government's independent advisor role for Islamophobia has been left vacant for over 1 year. The Prime Minister knows we discussed these matters over a year ago, yet no action has taken place. Prime Minister, enough is enough with regards to tackling anti-Muslim hatred. Will the government now finally take action?
Mr Speaker, we won't tolerate anti-Muslim hatred in any form and expect it to be dealt with wherever it occurs. I actually recently met Tal Mama, a service that provides support to victims of anti-Muslim hatred, who we have, in fact, supported with over £6 million of funding since its inception, and we're in regular dialogue with them. We have also, Mr Speaker, doubled the funding for protective security measures through the Protective Security for Mosques scheme, and will continue to do everything that we can to keep our Muslim community safe.
Leader Stephen Flynn.
Mr Speaker, in good news for kids this morning, it was snowing in Aberdeen, and when they looked out of the kitchen window, they would have been filled with delight. But for their parents, many of them who looked out the kitchen window this morning would have been filled with dread. Dread knowing that they simply can't afford to pay their energy bills. So in that context, can I ask the Prime Minister, does he regret offering no financial mechanism whatsoever towards families this winter?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, that's simply not right to say that there isn't support for families this winter. There's been considerable support this year for energy bills, and this winter, pensioner households, for example, will receive up to £300 alongside their winter fuel payment, because they're some of the most vulnerable households, and it's right that they get that support at a difficult time.
Stephen Flynn.
Mr Speaker, I appreciate it's difficult for the Prime Minister to empathise when he quite clearly can't understand. But to be clear to both him and indeed the whole House, this isn't a matter of energy production. Scotland produces 6 times more gas than we consume, and around 2/3 of our electricity already comes from renewable resources. This is a consequence of decades of failed energy policy here in Westminster. Now, those of us on these benches, we believe that Scotland's energy wealth and our energy resource should benefit the people of Scotland. Why doesn't he?
Mr Speaker, the entire energy grid infrastructure in this country is integrated, which brings benefits to people in every part of our United Kingdom. But when it comes to supporting people with energy bills, Mr Speaker, that's why earlier this year we increased benefits at the highest rate on record. It's why we've provided cost of living payments worth £900 on top of regular support. And it was right, Mr Speaker, not to wait till the last moment to give people that support. We gave it to them earlier this year so they would have the security security they need going into winter, and as I said, on top of the money for pensioners, and when there are cold snaps, we have cold weather payments that kick in, and the Warmth Homes discount providing an extra £150 to the most vulnerable households. All of that is the most considerable action taken by any government to help people with their energy bills.
The £400 million redevelopment of Kettering General Hospital is the #1 investment priority for local residents. The first part of this is a £50 million new energy plant to power the expanded and improved hospital. Will my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, please do all he can to ensure that the Department of Health gets spades in the ground on time next spring, so that we can get the construction of our redeveloped, much-loved local hospital fully underway?
Oh, can I thank my honourable friend for continuing to champion the new hospital in Kettering. We're absolutely committed to delivering the scheme for Kettering General Hospital, and as my honourable friend will be aware, the new energy centre is vital to the delivery of the new hospital, and we expect that work to begin in the first quarter of next year. The new hospital programme are working closely with the Trust to ensure that the plans are deliverable.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 3 years ago, the government made a commitment to 40 new hospitals and significant upgrades to hospitals in most need. But today, many schemes are badly delayed. The Royal Berkshire, stuck at the development stage with not a single pound transferred for construction. Harrogate Hospital, still waiting on £20 million for urgent upgrades after RAC was discovered. And there are 25 more schemes, Mr. Speaker. So will the Prime Minister explain why his government is happy to let patients, doctors and nurses suffer for years in such unfit and unsafe conditions?
Mr. Speaker, we are delivering 40 hospitals by 2030. Good progress is already being made, and that programme is being backed by over £20 billion of investment. 3 schemes are already open, 2 are opening this year, and 16 are in construction or work has begun to prepare the site. It is absolutely right, though, within that we prioritise RAC hospitals as part of that. That required a reprioritisation, but that was the appropriate thing to do to ensure safety. But all patients and staff are already benefiting from some of the improvements that we've made, which comes on top of the largest capital programme for the NHS in its history, rolling out community diagnostic centres, urgent treatment centres and surgical hubs right across the country.
Sarah Dines.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As disturbed as I was to learn that British politicians are being debanked by the National Westminster Bank, you can imagine my horror to find that an entire town, Bakewell in Derbyshire Dales, is being debanked by the National Westminster Bank. And in the whole of Derbyshire Dales and the Peak District, there's not a bank left. Can you share my concern, please? Will my right honourable friend share my concern that as we are the major shareholder, that the National Westminster Bank are ignoring my vulnerable, elderly people and also my businessmen? It's a big, thriving market town.
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is right that all customers, wherever they live, should have appropriate access to banking and cash services, which is why we've legislated to protect access to cash, and the FCA has issued guidance which seeks to ensure that branch closure decisions treat customers fairly. I know there's been an assessment about access to cash in her area, and the financial services sector will provide a new cash deposit service for her community, and also everyone can access the post office for regular banking services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, Cancer Research's UK manifesto, Longer, Better Lives, set out a roadmap to save 20,000 lives a year by 2040. Research is key to this, and they've identified a funding gap of over £1 billion. Cancer Research UK have told me that excluding research funded by industries, charities fund 62% of cancer research compared to the government's 38%. Is the Prime Minister ashamed of this, and what is he going to do to address this gap?
Mr. Speaker, of course the government must do more to continue preventing cancer deaths in our country. That's why we're focused on fighting cancer on all fronts: prevention, diagnosis, treatment, research and funding. Crucially, cancer is now being diagnosed at an earlier stage more often, with survival rates improving across all types of cancer, including the most common cancers. And through our treatment record, we are rolling out community diagnostic centres everywhere to ensure that we can reach those people as quickly as possible.
David Mundell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank you on behalf of the All-Party Group on HIV/AIDS for hosting today's reception to honour the incredible contribution that Sir Elton John has made to the fight against AIDS. I very much welcome today's announcement of further funding for HIV, hepatitis B and C opt-out testing in hospital emergency departments as a critical step in fighting these diseases, and ask the Prime Minister to join with me, and indeed I'm sure the whole House, in praising Sir Elton and his AIDS Foundation for pioneering this work.
Well, Mr. Speaker, Sir Elton John has been a powerful voice for change in the UK and the world, and through the brilliant work of his foundation, he's raised awareness of HIV, reduced stigma and saved lives, and I'm very pleased that this will be celebrated tonight at the HIV All-Party Group event. And ahead of World AIDS Day on Friday, I'd also like to reaffirm this government's commitment to ending new transmissions within England by 2030. And I know my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Health, will have more to say about the expansion of our recent pilot initiative on screening at tonight's event.
Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Pearl Melody Black was 22 months old when a car rolled off a private drive onto a highway and hit a wall that fell and killed her while she was holding her daddy's hand. The parents, my constituents Gemma and Paul, South Wales Police and the CPS were all frustrated that no charges could be brought in the case due to a loophole in the law. My 10-minute rule bill sought to amend the 1988 Road Traffic Act, but that fell as it didn't get parliamentary time. I know that colleagues across the House have similar issues, so can I ask the Prime Minister, would he meet with me and my constituents to assist in finding a way forward?
I'm incredibly sorry to hear about Pearl, and my thoughts, I know the whole House's thoughts will be with Gemma and Paul. I will make sure that the honourable member gets a meeting with the relevant minister on the legislation as quickly as possible.
Nikki Aiken.
Speaker, now we know that the Labour Party has an aversion to white band man, but does the Prime Minister share my concerns that according to a Daily Telegraph report today, that Labour-run Westminster Council is increasing parking charges for electric small vehicles by up to 1,800%, demonstrating that it doesn't support small businesses nor tackling climate change.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is right to raise these concerns, and it seems that Labour in London are yet again penalising hard-working people. First we had ULEZ, and now it seems they're hiking parking charges on white van drivers and small businesses, and I join my honourable friend in urging the Labour-run Westminster Council to rethink these damaging proposals.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I quote, "Rishi thinks just let people die and that's okay." This was reportedly the view of the Prime Minister of COVID during late 2020, as recorded by the then Chief Scientific Advisor in his diary. This came to light last week in the COVID inquiry, and I was shocked that Downing Street didn't categorically deny it. So could I ask the Prime Minister today, how is it that people who were closest to this issue, who he worked with day in, day out, at the top of government, how on earth did these people get the impression that the Prime Minister was okay with people in our country dying?
Minister, I think he's got the question, Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as the honourable lady knows, there is an ongoing inquiry into COVID, and it's right that that process followed, and I look forward to providing my own evidence. But if she had taken the time to actually read the evidence submitted to the inquiry, she will have seen that the person she mentioned, the Chief Science Advisor, confirmed that he did not hear me say that, and that's because I didn't.
Sir John Hayes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That 1.3 million migrants over a period of 2 years is a catastrophe for Britain is obvious to everyone apart from guilt-ridden bourgeois liberals and greed-driven globalists. So, given that the same kind of people are stymieing the Prime Minister's Stop the Boats campaign, will he bring urgent measures forward to deal with legal migration? And in terms of the bill that he's promised, will he ensure it is exactly in the form recommended by his own immigration minister?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to have the honourable gentleman's advice and support as in all our measures to tackle both legal and illegal migration. As I said, we are reviewing the recommendations of the MAC and will be bringing forward measures on top of the very significant restrictions that we've already announced on student dependence. And when it comes to stopping illegal migration, I've been crystal clear. We will bring forward legislation that makes it unequivocally the case that Rwanda is safe, and there will be no more ability of our domestic courts to block flights to Rwanda, and that's what our legislation will ensure.
Melissa McGovern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In response to my friend for Stockton North last week, the Prime Minister claimed that the best way to stop children living in poverty is for them to have parents who work. But, Mr. Speaker, over 70% of poor children already live in a home where someone goes out to work. So I'll give him another chance. Can he explain why reports say that 1 million of our children in 2022 experienced not just poverty, but destitution?
Well, Mr. Speaker, no child should grow up in poverty, and that's why I'm pleased that because of the measures we've taken, 1.7 million fewer people are living in poverty today than in 2010. I'd also say to the Honourable Lady that it is absolutely crystal clear that for children growing up in workless households are 4 or 5 times less likely to be in poverty. That's what the facts say. That's why our efforts are on getting people into work and making sure that work pays, which is why the actions in the autumn statement to raise the national living wage to record levels and provide a significant tax cut will do an extraordinary amount to continue lifting children out of poverty.
Jeremy Wright.
Speaker, and can I thank you for welcoming my constituent John Farringdon to Parliament this morning. At 110 years of age, John is among my more experienced constituents, and I know he would want me to ask the Prime Minister to join us in thanking the staff of Cubbington Mill Care Home for looking after him so well. But can I also ask my right honourable friend, when John comes to Downing Street this afternoon, to try and find a moment or two to speak to him? It may be a useful conversation for those obsessed with the opinion polls, as I think it's fair to say John has some experience at surviving against the odds.
Can I thank my right honourable friend for his question, and I very much hope I have a chance to meet John later on. And can I join with my honourable friend in paying tribute to his care home for the incredible care that they provide him. It's great that he's here, and I'm sure everyone will enjoy meeting him later today.
Sir Grant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister may already be aware from his colleagues of the exceptional contribution my constituent, Dr Hudura, has made during a 30-year career in our health service. He may also be aware that for the last 6 or 8 weeks she's been frantic with worry about her 83-year-old mum who is trapped in Palestine with a number of family members with no way out. Will he agree to work with the Foreign Office and the Home Office during this time of some hope in the Middle East to find an urgent way to get vulnerable people, such as Dr Hudura's mum, out of danger into a safe place of refuge while we can? Because once the ceasefire ends, so tragically will the chance of survival of too many people in Palestine.
Well, can I start by paying tribute to the honourable gentleman's constituent's long service in the health service, I think he mentioned, and can assure him that we're doing absolutely everything we can to ensure the safe passage of British nationals out of Gaza. I will ensure that the Department of Foreign Office get in touch with him. All British nationals that have been registered already with the Foreign Office have had significant interaction. We have successfully ensured the safe passage of well over 200 already, but we'll continue to do everything we can for those that are remaining, and I'll make sure that we're in touch with him and his constituent.
Rachel McLean.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Thanks to this Conservative government, the Alex Hospital in Redditch has received nearly £19 million of investment, and we are boosting training places at the Three Counties Medical School. So does the Prime Minister agree with me it's the perfect time to back my campaign to bring back services so that women, local mums, can once again give birth in their hometown and all children can be seen at the hospital no matter what illness they are experiencing.
Well, I know that my honourable friend campaigns passionately for the delivery of first-class healthcare for her constituents, and like her, I welcome the investment that the Alexandra Hospital has had in recent years in a whole range of different services. She will know that the reconfiguration of services are, of course, clinically led local decisions following the appropriate engagement with patients and stakeholders, but I know that my honourable friend will continue to make her case on behalf of her community.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In June, the Canadian Prime Minister claimed the Indian government may be linked to the killing of Canadian Sikh activist Hardeep Singh Nijjar in Canada. Now it is reported that the US government thwarted a second assassination attempt of a Canadian-American citizen on US soil. So will the Prime Minister reassure my Sikh constituents who have raised their safety concerns with me that this government is taking this matter very seriously and will raise their concern with its counterpart in India?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I've already made statements on this matter, but also crucially, of course, we ensure the safety of all communities in our country. That is the first duty of government, and we'll continue to do that, not just for the Sikh community, but every community here in the UK.
John Burrell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With both the OBR and ONS confirming that the British economy is now substantially larger than they estimated even a few months ago, does my right honourable friend agree that the economy has once again proven the detractors wrong, and will he do all he can to ensure that we retain record employment, because unemployment is a corrosive social evil?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend makes an excellent point. A year ago, not just the OBR, but the Bank of England, the IMF and the OECD were all predicting that we would fall into a recession this year. But thanks to the actions of this government and this Chancellor, we have actually grown the economy. You've seen that momentum carry on just in the past week with the announcement of Nissan, record investment in the new plant in Sunderland, safeguarding the future of thousands of jobs in the North East and ensuring the transition to electric vehicles, but also the summit that we hosted attracting £30 billion of new investment into the UK, which, as he said, crucially, will support thousands and thousands of jobs in our country.
Winter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are 2,500 disused coal tips in Wales. Welsh Government previously asked the Treasury for £600 million to make them safe, and ahead of the autumn statement, it sought an initial £20 million. But this Tory Government provided nothing. Rhondda Cynon Taf has the most high-risk coal tips of any local authority, and the spectre of Aberfan looms large over our communities. So can I ask the Prime Minister, does he think it right the UK took the economic benefit from Welsh coal, but won't fund the safety of its legacy?
Well, Mr. Speaker, what the UK government is doing is actually investing in Wales, record investment in North Wales electrification on the line, record investment in communities up and down the country. And it is important, Mr. Speaker, to recognise that just recently, the UK government has invested hundreds of millions of pounds to safeguard thousands of jobs at Tata Steel, right? And, Mr. Speaker, the Welsh Government does have access to the largest set of Barnett consequentials on record over the past couple of years and have the resources they need.
Jonathan Gillis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thanks to this Conservative government, the people of Stoke-on-Trent, North, Kidsgrove and Torque will see over £200 million to fix our broken roads, the reopening of the Stoke-to-Leek line, and secured over £30 million to bus back better by introducing fairer fares and smarter routes to better connect our communities. However, residents who have a free bus pass are being denied using it before 9:30 a.m. by the Labour-run Stoke-on-Trent City Council, meaning that people can't get to their GP appointment or to work. So will the Prime Minister back my campaign to end this unfair policy being imposed upon my residents?
Yeah, my honourable friend is absolutely right about the importance of high-quality bus services. That's why we have capped the cost of travelling on buses to £2 until the end of 2024 as a result of our decision on HS2, and also support councils with £1 billion of funding. I would urge all councils to ensure people see the benefits of that investment and wholeheartedly back his campaign.
Deirdre Brett.
Mr. Speaker, NHS England has awarded £330 million to Palantir, a controversial technology firm, to help it recover from its pandemic backlog, despite deep concerns among many healthcare professionals about privacy, ethics and the safety of patient data. In light of the government's recently commissioned report on unifying health data in the UK, can the Prime Minister confirm that no attempts will be made to force the Scottish Government to release the personal data of Scottish residents to any centralised system?
Mr. Speaker, as the Honourable Lady knows, healthcare is devolved, but we will look for every opportunity to improve patient care and reduce waiting lists in England, and that's what we're doing, developing new technology which has had a proven track record in bringing down waiting lists and improving the optimisation and efficiency of how theatres are scheduled. That's the type of thing that we need to do to ensure patients get the care they need and we can get efficiency in the NHS.
Final questions, Robert Betland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The increasing proliferation of AI-generated disinformation and deepfake poses a clear and present danger not only to our democratic process, but to the administration of justice itself. What further steps will my right honourable friend take following the Bletchley Summit to strengthen our domestic law when it comes to this threat to democracy, and take international action to provide the guardrails that I believe are essential if we are to maintain integrity in the administration of justice?
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I thank my honourable friend for all the work he's done in this incredibly important area. He's right that we need to have guardrails around the successful exploitation of this technology, which is why the Online Safety Bill gives the regulator significant new powers to regulate the content on social media companies, including some of the ones that he mentioned. But we're also working internationally, following up from the summit, to ensure that we can all get the benefits of this technology, but in the process safeguard our democracy, which is so crucial to the functioning of our country.
That completes Prime Minister's questions.
Well, Rishi Sunak will be glad that that session of Prime Minister's questions is over, because it was the most bruising encounter for him as Prime Minister against the Labour leader Keir Starmer. Let me welcome our guests for this part of Politics Live. For the government, Rebecca Powell, Environment Minister, Thangam Debonair for Labour Shadow Culture Secretary, and Vicky Young, the Deputy Political Editor. Well, I suppose Keir Starmer had an awful lot of potential issues to go on in terms of pressing the Prime Minister, and he chose the net migration figures, the record high net migration figures, because, of course, not only can he point the finger at the government at failing to meet any of the targets that they have put in place since 2010, but there is deep discomfort on the Conservative benches behind Rishi Sunak. He then went on to talk about the diplomatic row that he said has been caused by the Prime Minister, and said that he was engaging in small politics. What did you make of it all?
Yeah, and I think on both those issues, it really did leave Rishi Sunak on the back foot. I mean, he looked a bit lacklustre. I think you can always tell as well. I mean, we're not in there listening, but it felt like it was very quiet on the Conservative backbenches. They didn't have an awful lot to cheer about. And, you know, I think the very telling thing is that a Labour leader choosing to attack the Conservatives over immigration policy will be very, very alarming for those Tory MPs. As you say, they're not happy either. If you look at the policies that the government's trying to bring in at the moment, they're talking a lot, and they've made a lot about reducing illegal and legal migration. But of course, it's not working at the moment. The Rwanda policy is very much stuck. And then even where they can take action, they have this dilemma about wanting growth, wanting people to work in our health, in hospitals, in social care, and yet there are many people on the backbenches who are saying, look, we've got to bring these numbers down. So I think he's got a problem there. And as you say, you know, really, Keir Starmer laughing at the Prime Minister and saying that you've picked a fight with one of our allies, the Greek Prime Minister, and Rishi Sunak not backing down from that whatsoever. There was almost like a bit of a gasp when he talked about that they were grandstanding. So, you know, I think there is a problem here for the Conservatives. Rishi Sunak had, you know, some riposte to some of it, but, you know, I think he was very much struggling there. And I think until some of this immigration stuff is sorted out, and he's got an immigration minister who's publicly saying, I wanted to do things I haven't been allowed to do. This has to be sorted out before he can really come to the Commons with anything much to get back at the Labour leader about.
Rebecca, let's start with John Hayes, the Conservative MP, who accused the Prime Minister of failing to get a grip broadly with both legal and illegal migration. But on legal migration, the net migration figures, he said they were a catastrophe. Do you agree with him?
Well, look, this is a complicated issue. I think Vicky's more or less intimated that in what she said. The numbers are down a bit, but quite clearly they're too high, and we are the party that is committed to getting the numbers down.
But you failed to do so.
No,
you admit that.
So
you have.
what we must say, we had to welcome people in from Hong Kong, Ukraine, Afghanistan. That was the right thing to do. After COVID, of course, we desperately needed more healthcare workers and social care workers. That was the right thing to do. But what we need to do is have a raft of measures, which we have got, tackling the small boats. Actually, we've done that really big change, which was to cut the dependents that students are allowed to bring in. We did that, and that will cut 150,000 people that were coming in.
But hang on, Rebecca, let's just remind people what those figures are. It's 745,000 net migration. It is a record high. Is John Hayes right that 1.3 million migrants over 2 years, those were the figures he used, is a catastrophe?
Look, it's an issue not just in our country,
I'm
but
only
across,
talking about our country.
Well, I think that you do need to look at this on a big picture.
Well, no,
so
because
the measures
the
we've
government's
taken,
pledged to bring that down. First of all, to tens of thousands. Then it was going to be coming down dramatically, the overall number, to about 250,000. And it's trebled.
Well, it's still a commitment to get the numbers down, which is why we're tackling it from all avenues. And the small boats, we have actually reduced.
We'll come on to those in a minute. Well, we'll come on to those in a minute.
But in Central Europe,
but the pledge is to stop them.
80%.
The pledge is to stop them.
We're working on every avenue. We're really working closely with the French. We've got a much better system there for stopping those boats leaving their shores. We're working on the Rwanda situation.
When are we going to get the legislation on that?
So that will go forward as a piece of legislation that will come through our Parliament very shortly.
Next week?
And that will help. I don't run the Parliament.
All right. As I say, we'll come on to Rwanda in just a moment. What figure should it be? We heard from Darren Jones, Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, saying he thought it should be in the region of 250,000. Will that be a commitment?
I think we've all seen the danger of putting numbers on figures and failing to take into account that world events happen, such as Ukraine, when this country rightly wanted to give a warm British welcome to people who needed refuge. But what we've got from the government is complete failure, even to acknowledge their own failure. Their numbers have gone up and up and up, and it's not just about refugees from Ukraine.
No.
It's actually about skilled workers who the government has consistently failed to plan for. Now, I became an MP in 2015, and I remember having a conversation with the Health Minister then about workforce strategies. And here we still are, with no sign that they've learnt any of the lessons.
But what could you do differently? You are absolutely right that putting aside refugees, they were a substantial number, it's come down quite a lot. The majority of those net migration figures are students and people working here.
Yes.
And the government have chosen to do that. They have. So who would you have not come here?
Well, let's start with the fact that the government has persisted with a perverse incentive for employers to pay foreign workers less than British workers with a 20% discount on the skilled worker visa. Instead of thinking for the future and planning for those jobs of the future, they have consistently failed to have a decent workforce plan and to remove that perverse incentive. That's one thing that they could do.
Well, let's do that.
And we would scrap it.
Why don't you get rid of that?
What I would say to Thangam, as she should be fully aware, we're investing 2.4 billion on the workforce plan to skill up our health workers and more people in the medical department. We're pouring money, for example, into my department, into skills and innovation, so we have more technology in our abattoirs, in our horticulture. So we don't need to bring more people.
But what about the wage discrepancy? Answer that direct question, because people won't understand why it is that you can bring somebody over to the UK and pay them 20% less than somebody you would employ here. That does sound like an incentive, perverse or otherwise, to bring them over.
Well, perverse, I would say, is Labour carping on about this all the time. When Keir Starmer has stood up in the chamber and says that he wants free and open movement everywhere,
He's
and the
not
first thing
said
he'll do
any
is hand it
such
all back to the
thing.
EU
Just
and let them sort it all
making
out.
stuff
So good
up.
luck.
Well, hang
sorting
on.
out
Making stuff up,
on that,
Rebecca, doesn't
on
hide
that
the fact.
basis.
Don't talk over each other.
Doesn't hide the fact that you have refused to get rid of the 20% discount. It's extraordinary. And planning for the workforce of the future meant planning 8 years ago, 9 years ago for what we need now. We knew in 2015 that we had a shortage of NHS and care staff, and it's got worse. And so it's NHS and social care staff that's shot up over the last few years under this Tory government.
Might it encourage more people to come over if you actually get rid of that and pay them more?
Well, what we really need to do is have a workforce training and skills plan, and under a Labour government, what we would do is require employers who want to have visas for people coming from abroad, for legal migration, we would require them to have a training and workforce plan, but we would also have one ourselves, and this government has patently failed to do that. They failed to plan for the future, and that's why we know...
But you're not going to bring the numbers down anytime soon, because you couldn't on the basis of what you've said if you win next year.
Well, we want to make sure that when there are job opportunities, that British people actually have a fair go, and the failure to get rid of the 20% discount, and I note the government minister hasn't done that, is part of that problem.
Vicky, John Hayes, the Conservative MP that I was talking about, sort of, if not represents, is part of a wing of the party that would certainly like some stringent measures to bring down net migration. He also referred to legislation that he wants to see in as soon as possible to deal with the Supreme Court ruling on Rwanda and making Rwanda safe. What are the options?
Well, what's interesting here is, I mean, that was 2 weeks ago, I think, that ruling, and at the time we were told that it was days away, that there was something very simple that could be brought in to sort of deal with this. Now, clearly it isn't that simple, and there are Conservative MPs who really want the government to go a lot further than I think that they will be doing, and I think we did get a clear hint there from Rishi Sunak about what he's going to do. He's talking there about passing a bill which would simply say Rwanda is safe, and they hope that that would be enough, that would mean that that couldn't be challenged in the courts anymore because Parliament has effectively spoken. Of course, what Conservative MPs want to do is go much further than that and effectively suspend human rights laws when it comes to asylum cases. It doesn't seem, from what Rishi Sunak said there, that that's the plan that they're coming along with. But although he did say he thought it would be watertight and he thought it would work.
What do you think of that? Where are you on this issue?
Well, there's a great deal of work going on this behind the scenes to make sure that Rwanda is safe, that it ticks the right boxes. If we do get people there, the commitment is to get the flights off the ground. And Rishi has said
should it be that simple that you just pass a bill that says Rwanda is safe and you allow MPs to do that, or should you go further, as many Conservatives would like you to do, to try and remove any challenge and have the UK leave the European Convention on Human Rights?
Rishi has said that if the European Court of Human Rights interferes with our Parliament, he will do whatever it takes to make sure that we can do what we want. He said that quite recently. So work is underway. But what I would say is this is only one of the measures that we will need in this whole raft of measures to tackle this.
But it is one the government has talked about a lot and set a lot of store by. And I think, isn't that part of the issue? It was something Kwasi Kwarteng said earlier, which was very interesting, where he said, if you talk about the issue a lot, as the Conservatives have done, think it's very important, you set targets but you don't meet them, then isn't the danger that actually it just makes people think that you're not delivering on it, and then the danger for you is that they turn to a different party, maybe Reform UK?
The BBC love a target, and to keep mentioning them, but...
It's because you've set these targets, Rebecca.
Interestingly, a lot of other countries are now looking at what we are proposing. They're all under the same pressures with this issue of movement of people. And what I would say, which we haven't touched on at all, I am the Environment Minister. Yes. A lot of this links back to climate change.
But the agenda is being sent. Now, hang on, Rebecca. I know you want to go and talk about that, but we have to talk about what the Prime Minister is being asked at Prime Minister's Questions. One of the Prime Minister's key pledges, we haven't plucked this issue out of thin air as the BBC, is to stop the boats. Now, if you didn't want us to talk about it, why did you make a pledge?
So on the boats, because clearly we're a small island, we have a big population, it is an issue.
I know
but
that.
We're also a fair and welcoming society, which is why we welcomed in, obviously, the Ukrainians. We needed to take the people
But was it a mistake? Because you can't do it. You just can't manage to achieve it.
I mentioned earlier, we've already managed to reduce the small boats by a third. That's a pretty big move. And actually in the central Mediterranean, their numbers have increased by 80%. I think that shows how
Maybe you
tricky
could
it is,
speak
but
to
it does
Greece
show
about
we're
what
on the
they're
right
doing.
track.
I mean, this is the other problem here, isn't it? You know, this what's become a pretty big diplomatic spat now. Greece is on the front line, lots of people say. Wouldn't it have been useful for the Prime Minister to speak to him?
Well, the intention, I believe, obviously I wasn't party to any of these arrangements, was that those were the kind of issues we were going to be discussing.
And yet the Prime Minister dumped
was
him.
there. We're great allies. We have a
Dumped him.
lot to cover and a lot in common. But I believe assurances were given that time wouldn't be wasted in that meeting, opening up old issues that are historic issues like the
old
the
historic
Parthenon-
issues. We all know
Parthenon
historic.
things. But
Anyway,
in fairness, you know that was the issue.
All right,
and they're still our friends and our allies, and we have
funny
much
way of
more
showing it.
to discuss.
do you think it was right, though, to pick a fight with the Prime Minister of Greece?
I believe that what I've been told is that they reneged on the assurances they were given that the meeting wouldn't be used to open up this old
Let's
issue.
clear.
Oh,
Rishi
come
and Ken
on,
wanted to
Rebecca,
move
come
and
on.
be
This is not an
constructive.
old issue.
But of course
he
the-
cancelled the meeting at the last moment, and I think he was quite dismissive there in Prime Minister.
Accused him of grandstanding.
He accused an ally of grandstanding.
all
What
right.
sort of diplomatic behaviour is that?
Well, we'll leave that with the government and number 10. Perhaps you can clear up something for us, because we were left confused on the programme and our viewers by your colleague Preet Gill, the Shadow Health Minister, responding to this headline here: Labour denies abandoning £28 billion green pledge, because there had been reports at the weekend that perhaps it was being dropped after the Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, had said that it was going to be pushed back. You were going to start investing £28 billion a year in green policies towards the end of a first Labour term. But then Preet Gill, in response to me, said this: we were told Labour are committed to spending and investing up to £28 billion a year. When?
Look, the fiscal situation at the moment, as we're very clear from our Shadow Chancellor, is that the 28 billion is likely to be hit at a second term of a Labour government.
A second term?
No, it's the second half of the first term. And, you know, they're under pressure. I think that there are lots of things that we all do that just want to clear that up. I think it's really important we had that clarification over the weekend. It was a firm commitment from Rachel Reeves at our conference, I think, 2 years ago now.
21.
And we are very determined to spend this. And we need to, because our energy security needs require it, because our climate change needs require it, but also because people are suffering under a cost of living crisis in which successive Tory governments have utterly failed to invest in the cheapest form of energy generation there is, which is onshore wind. We would also be investing in solar, in offshore, developing other technologies as well. That's going to help us to leverage in private money. For every £1 that we invest, we'll get £3 in.
I understand the ambition, and you say it's still a commitment. Where did those reports come from, then, that you just might not be able to do it at all?
I've absolutely no idea, but I spoke to the Shadow Chancellor, the leader of the Labour Party, and various other people on Saturday morning who were all completely clear that that was not a change of policy. We are sticking to our commitment, and it's because we know it's necessary. It is vital that we invest in the technologies of the future.
It's not quite the
for
same
climate
commitment
change.
it originally was, is it?
What is no, it's a pity, isn't it?
But
Because
it was, 28 billion. We all thought was going to be every year immediately. It's not that anymore. It will ramp up. But also Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, has been very clear that the fiscal rule comes first.
It has
so
to.
Actually, it could be trumped by that. So it's not that firm. And also, she's put in another caveat, which is to say that for every £1 invested, it has to attract £3 of private money.
And that's good. That's a good thing.
But
That's a good thing.
But that's not the same commitment that was made originally.
It's a very good thing. Well, I wish we were in a situation where we could promise to do exactly what we would like to do. But unfortunately, last year, by just trouncing the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility, failing to publish their report and having a disastrous Tory budget which has crashed the economy and sent people's mortgages sky high, we're just not in the same situation.
It might not happen at all.
It's very
then.
important
Could it not
that
happen
the
at all?
public can see that they're making a choice between a government that crashes the economy and one that has strong fiscal rules.
Is Vicky right? Are the fiscal rules more important than that £28 billion a year
The fiscal rules are that we will not borrow for day-to-day spending, and that's not this, and that we will bring debt down as falling as a share of GDP. But in order to do that, we need growth, and this is part of our growth plan. It's vital for the future that we invest, and that's the commitment that we're making within fiscal rules.
Rebecca, as you say, you're an Environment Minister. Let me just show you this headline in Politico. Theresa May, former Prime Minister, UK is falling behind on climate action. The former Prime Minister appeared to align herself with recent critics of UK climate leadership ahead of COP28, partly because of the policies, the watering down by Rishi Sunak of things like banning, the timetable for banning the sale of petrol and diesel cars. Do you agree with Theresa May?
So you're talking about the net zero commitment. We still have all our targets in place for net zero, and we're on track to meet them. He has just listened to people, and in fact, you know, my own constituents were feeding in issues about when they had to change their boilers and do the upgrading that was required, and we listened, and we've made a few changes to dates of when electric cars come in. Similarly, with business, we're on track.
Right,
okay?
she being Theresa May, was also talking about the failure to revoke oil and gas licences, new ones, exploration in the North Sea. Is she right on that? Was a mistake?
What I want to talk about in particular is what we're doing on the raft of measures, in particular in getting nature into this space, which I absolutely know Theresa May would agree with me with. So we are going to COP28 to put our position, to build on what we did in COP26 and the
Alok Sharma, who was the head of COP26,
strategy.
said that we're falling behind too.
Well, we've got targets, and that's why in this country we brought through the Environment Act with the Environment Improvement Plan, with all the targets to keep us on track to restore nature, to recover nature, and to prevent deforestation globally. And we have a huge project running on that.
All right, we're going to have
our agricultural.
We've run out of
farmers.
We've run out of time. That's all we have time for today. I will let them discuss it after the programme has ended. But from all of us here, bye-bye.